Ezra, when you first saw that house in the rain, what did you think you were walking into?
Just shelter, Tony. 4 walls and a roof that didn't leak. I was 16, soaked to the bone, and I'd been sleeping in doorways since the funeral. The Bellwether house looked like every other abandoned Victorian in Millbrook. Rotting wood, broken windows, the kind of place kids dare each other to touch on Halloween. But when I stepped inside, the mathematics of the architecture lit up in my mind like fireworks. Purple spirals where the ceiling met the walls, golden fractals dancing along the floorboards. My synesthesia was going crazy. I should have run right then, but I was so tired of being cold and afraid. I thought I was the one who was going to change that house.
But what if the house had been waiting to change you instead?
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
The thing that strikes me about your story, Ezra, is how you describe that moment of stepping inside. You mentioned your synesthesia lighting up like fireworks. For our listeners who might not be familiar, can you help us understand what it's like to see mathematics as colors?
Imagine walking into a room and instead of just seeing walls and furniture, you see the underlying structure of everything singing in color. When I look at an equation, it's not numbers on paper, it's rivers of blue flowing into amber pools, or crimson spirals climbing toward violet peaks. That night at the Bellwether house, the geometry was wrong in ways that made my vision explode. Normal Victorian architecture should have shown me steady gold lines, maybe some soft green curves. But this place was throwing off colors I'd never seen before, Tony. Colors that don't have names.
And you were just a 16-year-old kid, grieving your grandmother's death, looking for somewhere dry to sleep.
Grandmother Iris had been my whole world since I was 7. My parents died in a car accident, and she took me in without hesitation. She understood my condition, you know, when other adults would get frustrated because I'd describe homework as too orange or refuse to enter buildings that tasted like static. She just nodded and worked with it. She'd say, "Ezra, honey, your brain sees patterns the rest of us miss. Don't ever let anyone convince you that's a weakness."
She sounds like she really saw you for who you were.
She did more than that. Iris had been an electrical engineer back in the 50s, one of the few women in her field. She taught me to build circuits before I could ride a bike. Our little apartment above Kowalski's hardware store was crammed with her old equipment, vacuum tubes, oscilloscopes, breadboards covered in components that looked like tiny cities. When she passed from cancer, I thought I'd inherit that place, continue her work. Instead, I learned that the building had been sold months earlier to pay for her treatments. She'd been keeping it from me, trying to spare me the worry.
So you found yourself completely alone, with nowhere to turn.
The social services lady, Mrs. Henderson, kept talking about foster families and group homes. But Tony, I'd been listening to the stories at school for years. Kids who got shuffled from house to house, their belongings stuffed into garbage bags, never knowing if they'd be safe or fed or understood. The idea of trying to explain my synesthesia to strangers, of being treated like a problem to solve rather than a person with gifts, I couldn't face it.
So you ran.
I lasted 3 days sleeping rough before I found the Bellwether house. 3 days of October rain in Oregon, which if you've never experienced it, is like being slowly dissolved. I'd been carrying my grandmother's old leather satchel with her notebooks and some basic tools. Everything was soaked through. I was shivering so hard I could barely think straight. That's when I saw the house sitting on Maple Hill, dark against the storm clouds.
What did you know about the place before you broke in?
Every town has its ghost stories, and the Bellwether house was Millbrook's crown jewel of local legends. The Bellwether family had built it in 1894, textile money from the mills down by the river. But they'd vanished in 1923, all 4 of them just gone one morning with breakfast still on the table and clothes hanging in the closets. Over the decades, a few other families had tried to make it home. The Kowalskis in the 40s, the Chen family in the 70s, some art students in the 90s, same story every time. They move in with grand plans, then disappear without a trace within a year or 2.
But at 16, desperate and cold, those stories probably seemed less important than getting dry.
Exactly. I figured if the place was truly haunted, the ghosts would have to get in line behind hypothermia and starvation. The back door was easy enough to force. The wood around the lock was so rotted it practically crumbled at my touch. But the moment I stepped into that kitchen, Tony, I knew I was in trouble.
Because of what your synesthesia was showing you?
The mathematical wrongness was overwhelming. Imagine looking at a circle that your eyes insist is also somehow a square. The kitchen was rectangular, maybe 12 by 15 feet, but the color patterns I was seeing suggested spaces that folded in on themselves. Purple equations spiraling up from the floorboards, golden geometric forms that seemed to exist in more dimensions than should be possible. I actually got dizzy and had to sit down on this old wooden chair that was probably older than my grandmother.
But you stayed.
I told myself it was just exhaustion, maybe dehydration affecting my perceptions. And honestly, despite the visual chaos, there was something comforting about the place. The kitchen had this massive cast iron stove that looked like it belonged in a restaurant. Copper pots hung from hooks, tarnished green but solid. There was even running water, though it came out rust-colored for the first few minutes. Someone had been paying the utilities all these years, probably the city, keeping the pipes from freezing and the place from becoming a total ruin.
So, you decided to stay the night?
I found a bedroom on the second floor that felt less mathematically chaotic than the rest of the house. Just soft blue patterns along the walls, gentle curves that reminded me of my grandmother's lullabies. There was still a bed frame there, and I used my jacket as a blanket. For the first time in days, I was warm and dry. I should have been afraid, but instead I felt this strange sense of belonging, like the house was welcoming me home.
When did you first start to suspect that this feeling might not be entirely natural?
The next morning when I woke up and found that my jacket had been folded neatly on a chair across the room. I was certain I'd fallen asleep wearing it. Small thing, but it made me pause. Then I went down to the kitchen and saw that the rust had completely cleared from the water. The faucet was running clean and cold, like the pipes had been flushed overnight by invisible hands.
What did you tell yourself was happening?
Old houses settle, pipes clear themselves. Maybe I'd been more restless in my sleep than I remembered. I was 16 and homeless, Tony. I needed this place to be safe more than I needed it to make sense, so I decided to stay another night, then another. Within a week, I'd started thinking of it as home.
And that's when you began your improvements to the house.
I couldn't help myself. It's like my grandmother always said, I see patterns, and patterns want to be completed. The electrical system was a mess of knob and tube wiring from the 20s mixed with some half-hearted updates from the 50s. Dangerous as hell, but also fascinating. I started small, just replacing some frayed connections with supplies I'd salvaged from dumpsters behind the electronics stores downtown.
You were essentially living off the grid at this point.
Completely. I'd sneak into the public library during the day to use the computers and stay warm. Mrs. Patterson, the head librarian, pretended not to notice when I'd wash up in the bathroom or when I'd doze off in the corner with a book about electrical engineering. She was kind that way, never asked questions, just made sure there was always a thermos of hot soup waiting on the reference desk around noon.
But your real work was happening back at the house.
Every evening, I'd return with whatever components I'd found or traded for. The house became my laboratory. I rigged up LED strips to replace the old gas fixtures powered by a solar panel I'd rescued from a construction site, built a small radio to keep me company, connected motion sensors to create automatic lighting that would follow me from room to room. Each improvement felt like a conversation with the building itself.
A conversation?
That's the only way I can describe it, Tony. I'd install something new, and the house would respond. Not immediately. It was subtle at first. I'd add lighting to the front hallway, and the next morning I'd find that the wallpaper in that area looked somehow fresher, less faded. I'd repair a section of the hardwood flooring, and nearby windows would seem cleaner, clearer. It felt like the house was healing itself in response to my care.
Looking back now, how do you interpret those changes?
Long pause. I think the house was learning about me, studying what made me happy, what gave me a sense of accomplishment. Every time I felt proud of an improvement I'd made, every time I stepped back and admired my work, the house was taking notes, building a profile of my desires and fears.
You mentioned fears. What were you afraid of during those early weeks?
Being found, mainly. Mrs. Henderson and the social services people were still looking for me. I'd see missing person posters with my photo around town. I was terrified they'd drag me away from the only place that felt like home since my grandmother died. But there were other fears too. Sometimes at night I'd hear sounds from other parts of the house. Footsteps in the attic, doors closing in rooms I hadn't entered yet. Old houses make noise, but these sounds felt purposeful, like someone else was living there just out of sight.
Did you ever investigate these sounds?
A few times. But here's the strange thing. Whenever I'd follow the noise, I'd find rooms that looked recently lived in. A teacup still warm on a kitchen table. Books open as if someone had just stepped away. Fresh flowers in a vase, which was impossible because it was November and the garden had been dead for decades. I started to wonder if maybe the previous tenants hadn't vanished at all. Maybe they were still there, just existing in spaces I couldn't quite reach.
That must have been terrifying.
You'd think so, but it wasn't. That's what scares me now, looking back. It felt comforting, like I was part of some ongoing story. The house was filling up with life again, and I was contributing to that renewal. I convinced myself I was bringing the place back from the dead through my improvements, awakening something beautiful that had been sleeping.
When did you first realize that you might be the one being changed by the house, rather than the other way around?
Pause. There was a mirror in the main hallway, this ornate Victorian piece with a silver frame carved like twisted vines. At first, it just showed what mirrors should show, my reflection, the room behind me, normal things. But after I'd been there about a month, I started noticing that my reflection looked healthier than I felt, better fed, less tired, like I was seeing an idealized version of myself.
And that didn't alarm you?
It should have, Tony. But when you're a homeless teenager who's been eating scraps and sleeping rough, seeing yourself look strong and capable felt like hope rather than horror. I thought maybe I really was getting better, building a life worth living. The mirror was just showing me my potential.
But there's more to the story.
Oh, there's so much more. We've barely scratched the surface of what that house could do, what it wanted from me. Tomorrow, I want to tell you about the room that shouldn't exist, the one I found when I started exploring the upper floors, and about the notebooks I discovered there, filled with handwriting that looked remarkably like my own.
Notebooks with your handwriting, but you didn't write them.
That's what I told myself at the time. But now I wonder if maybe I had written them, just not yet. Time worked differently in the Bellwether house. Past and future seemed to fold together like origami, creating spaces where dreams and reality couldn't be distinguished. And somewhere in those folds, I think I started to lose track of which Ezra was real. The scared, hungry boy who'd broken in looking for shelter, or the confident young inventor that the house kept showing me in its mirrors.
We'll pick up there tomorrow. Thank you for sharing this with us, Ezra.
Thank you for listening, Tony. And to everyone out there, if you've ever found yourself in a place that seemed too good to be true, pay attention to that instinct. Sometimes paradise is just another word for a beautiful trap.
Before we dive into those notebooks and that impossible room you mentioned, I have to ask, when you woke up this morning after yesterday's conversation, how did it feel to speak those words out loud? Sometimes, paradise is just another word for a beautiful trap.
Pause. Like I was finally telling the truth after years of lying to myself, Tony. I've spent so long trying to rationalize what happened in that house, trying to find scientific explanations for things that defied every law of physics I understood. But saying it plainly, that I was trapped in something beautiful, it felt like admitting I'd been an addict describing my drug as medicine.
That's a powerful comparison. And it brings us to what you discovered in those upper floors, the room that shouldn't exist. Can you set the scene for us? How long had you been living in the Bellwether house when you decided to explore beyond that second-floor bedroom?
About 6 weeks. I'd established routines by then, Tony. I had my workshop set up in what used to be the dining room, with salvaged electronics spread across this massive mahogany table. I'd rigged a pretty sophisticated security system, using motion detectors and cameras I'd pulled from abandoned businesses downtown. The house felt like mine, like I'd earned the right to claim it room by room.
So you felt confident enough to venture into unexplored territory?
Exactly. And I was getting curious about those sounds I mentioned, the footsteps, the doors closing. They seemed to come from above, from the third floor that I hadn't dared visit yet. One evening, after I'd successfully installed a new water heater I'd salvaged from a construction site, I was feeling particularly proud of myself, accomplished. That's when I decided to climb the narrow staircase to the top of the house.
What did your synesthesia show you as you climbed those stairs?
Long pause colors I'd never seen before, Tony. My grandmother had always told me that mathematics was universal, that the patterns I saw in color were just my brain's way of processing fundamental truths about reality. But these colors, they weren't part of any equation I recognized. deep purples that seemed to fold inward on themselves, gold spirals that moved independently of the architecture they were supposed to represent. It was like climbing into another dimension disguised as Victorian woodwork.
But you kept climbing.
The house had never hurt me. Every change it made had been positive, welcoming. I trusted it the way you'd trust a beloved pet or a close friend. When I reached the third-floor landing, there were 3 doors. 2 led to what you'd expect: a bathroom with an old clawfoot tub, a small bedroom with furniture covered in white sheets. But the third door opened onto something impossible.
Describe what you saw.
A workshop, Tony. But not just any workshop. It was like walking into my deepest fantasy of what a perfect laboratory should be. The room was easily 3 times larger than the dimensions of the house should have allowed. Walls lined with tools I'd only seen in engineering textbooks, some I'd dreamed of owning but could never afford. Workbenches organized exactly the way I preferred, with component drawers labeled in my own handwriting. And the lighting, oh, the lighting was perfect. Bright but warm, no shadows anywhere, like the room itself was generating illumination.
You mentioned notebooks with your handwriting. Where did you find those?
On the central workbench, open to pages, covered with detailed schematics. Designs for inventions I'd never conceived but immediately understood. A device for converting synesthetic visions directly into mathematical proofs. Plans for a machine that could translate emotional states into musical compositions. Blueprints for things that shouldn't be possible, written in my precise handwriting but signed with dates that were months in the future.
How did you explain this to yourself?
Laughs bitterly. You know what the terrifying part was, Tony? I didn't question it. That's what scares me most looking back, how quickly I accepted the impossible. I told myself I must have sleepwalked, that my subconscious mind was working on these problems while I slept. The room felt so right, so perfectly tailored to my needs, that questioning it seemed ungrateful.
Ungrateful to whom?
That's the question I should have asked then, but didn't until much later. I felt grateful to the house itself, like it was a generous benefactor providing me with everything I needed to become the inventor I'd always dreamed of being. I started spending 12, 14 hours a day in that impossible workshop, building devices from the future notebooks, watching my synesthetic visions become tangible reality.
What kind of devices were you creating?
Beautiful things, Tony. Terrible and beautiful. I built a kaleidoscope that showed mathematical truths as dancing patterns of light. You could look into it and see the solution to any equation written in colors that sang. I constructed a music box that played melodies based on the Fibonacci sequence, each note corresponding to the golden ratio in ways that made listeners weep without understanding why. And I started work on something the notebooks called the reality engine, a machine that could supposedly make synesthetic visions manifest in the physical world.
Did any of these inventions actually work?
They worked better than they should have, and that's what I should have recognized as the warning sign. The kaleidoscope didn't just show mathematical patterns, it showed me solutions to problems I hadn't even formulated yet. The music box didn't just play pretty songs, it seemed to calm my fears and amplify my sense of belonging in the house. Everything functioned perfectly, as if the laws of physics were being gently bent to accommodate my creations.
You're describing a kind of feedback loop between your desires and the house's responses.
Yes, exactly. The house would show me what I wanted, the perfect workshop, the impossible inventions, and I would pour my creativity into making those visions real. But each success made me more dependent on the house's gifts, less able to imagine existing anywhere else. I stopped venturing into town except for the most essential supplies. I told myself I was finally living the life my grandmother had prepared me for, using my gifts to their fullest potential.
When did you first suspect that this perfect arrangement might come with a cost?
When I found the other notebooks, Tony, hidden in a drawer that shouldn't have been accessible, the kaleidoscope revealed its location during one of my sessions with it. These weren't filled with my handwriting. They belonged to previous residents of the house, the Kowalskis, the Chen family, those art students from the 90s. Page after page of excited discoveries, descriptions of impossible rooms perfectly tailored to their dreams and talents.
What did their final entries say?
Long pause, that's what was so chilling. There were no final entries, Tony. The writing just became more and more disconnected from reality. The art students wrote about galleries that existed only in the house, where they displayed masterpieces to audiences of shadows. Mrs. Chen described a kitchen that could produce any dish she imagined, fed by ingredients that grew in a garden existing in perpetual summer. But between the lines, you could sense them becoming isolated, detached from the outside world, pouring everything they were into creations that could only exist within the house's influence.
Did you recognize what was happening to you at that point?
I should have, but recognition and acceptance are different things. Part of me understood that I was following the same pattern, but the house had become so central to my identity that leaving felt impossible. Where else could I build impossible machines? Where else could I see my synesthetic visions become tangible reality? The house wasn't just giving me shelter, it was giving me purpose, validation, a sense that my strange mind finally had a place where it belonged.
Tomorrow, I want to explore how this realization began to change your relationship with the house and what you discovered about the true nature of those vanished residents. But before we end today, can you tell our listeners what you would say to that 16-year-old boy who first found those notebooks?
Pause. I'd tell him to run, Tony. Run fast and run far, no matter how perfect the gifts seem, no matter how much the house feels like home. I'd tell him that the most beautiful prisons are the ones we choose to enter ourselves, and that true creativity, real innovation, can only flourish in the messy, imperfect, sometimes painful reality of the actual world. But honestly, I don't think that boy would have listened. The house knew exactly what he needed to hear to stay, and it was very, very good at speaking his language.
Thank you for sharing this with us, Ezra. Tomorrow we'll continue with what you discovered about the fate of those previous residents.
Until tomorrow, Tony. And to anyone listening who's ever felt the pull of a place that promises to make all your dreams come true, remember the dreams are meant to inspire us to change the world, not to replace it.
We're back with Ezra Blackwood, and yesterday you left us with that haunting image of dreams replacing the world rather than inspiring us to change it. I have to say, Ezra, when I went home last night, I found myself looking at my own house differently, wondering what it might be offering me in exchange for my presence there.
That's exactly the kind of awareness I wish I'd had back then, Tony. The ability to step outside and examine the bargains we make with the places that shelter us. But when you're 16 and you've found what feels like paradise, that kind of critical thinking becomes almost impossible.
Let's talk about those other notebooks you discovered, the ones written by previous residents. You mentioned that their entries became increasingly disconnected from reality. Can you give us some specific examples of what you read?
Pause. There was one entry from Maria Santos, one of the art students from the 90s. She wrote about discovering a studio in the house's basement that had perfect north light, even though the windows faced south. She described painting portraits of people she'd never met, but who felt more real to her than her friends at the art college. The final entries I could find from her were just lists of colors, not regular colors, but things like the blue of forgotten lullabies and the gold of laughter that never fades.
Those sound almost like synesthetic descriptions. Did you recognize similarities between her experience and your own?
That's what was so unsettling, Tony. Each resident seemed to find their own version of that impossible workshop I discovered. Maria found her perfect studio. Dr. Chen, who was apparently some kind of botanist in the 60s, wrote about a greenhouse that existed in eternal spring, where she could grow flowers that bloomed in mathematical sequences. The Kowalski children described a playroom where their imaginary friends became visible and tangible.
All of them found their deepest creative desires fulfilled.
Exactly. And reading their notebooks felt like reading prophecy, because I could see myself following the exact same arc. The initial wonder and gratitude, the growing dependence on the house's gifts, the gradual disconnect from outside relationships and responsibilities. Dr. Chen stopped attending faculty meetings. Maria quit her classes. The Kowalskis pulled their children out of school because the lessons at home were so much more vivid and engaging.
What did you think happened to these people? At that point, did you still believe they had simply vanished?
Long pause. I was starting to suspect something much more disturbing, Tony. There were moments in that impossible workshop when I'd catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision. Someone working at a distant workbench, or the shadow of a person passing by a window that shouldn't exist. When I'd turn to look directly, there'd be nothing there, but I'd find fresh work on projects I hadn't touched. Equations solved in handwriting that wasn't quite mine. Components arranged in patterns I hadn't created.
You thought they were still there.
I was beginning to understand that there might not mean what I thought it meant. The house existed in layers, Tony, like an onion made of dreams and memories and desires. I think each resident found their perfect space, their ideal creative environment, and gradually sank deeper into those layers until they couldn't find their way back to the surface reality we all share.
That's a terrifying image. How did this realization affect your own behavior in the house?
You'd think it would have frightened me enough to leave, but the house was cleverer than that. Every time I'd start to feel afraid or suspicious, something wonderful would happen. I'd make a breakthrough on the reality engine, or I'd discover a new room perfectly suited to some project I'd been struggling with. The house seemed to know exactly when to offer rewards that would keep me invested in staying.
Speaking of the reality engine, can you describe what that device was supposed to do?
According to the future notebooks, God, it sounds insane saying that out loud, the reality engine would allow me to take my synesthetic visions and project them into physical space. Imagine being able to pull the colors of mathematics out of my mind and paint them onto the air itself, creating three-dimensional sculptures of pure thought. For someone like me who'd spent his whole life trying to explain what I saw to people who couldn't see it, this felt like the ultimate validation.
Did you complete the construction of this device?
Pause, I thought I did, Tony. After about 2 months of obsessive work, following blueprints that seemed to update themselves as I progressed, I built something that looked exactly like the final diagrams. It was beautiful, all crystalline components and copper spirals, humming with an energy that made my synesthetic visions dance, even when I wasn't doing mathematics.
What happened when you activated it?
The most wonderful and terrible thing I'd ever experienced. The workshop filled with colors that existed outside normal perception, not just the colors I usually saw, but entirely new spectrums that corresponded to emotions I didn't have names for. Mathematical relationships became visible as flowing ribbons of light. The golden ratio manifested as an actual golden pathway I could have walked on, if I'd dared.
But there was something wrong with it.
The colors were too perfect, Tony. Too pure. Real synesthesia is messy, unpredictable, sometimes overwhelming, but always authentically connected to actual mathematical relationships. What the reality engine showed me was like artificial sweetener compared to honey. It hit all the right notes, but lacked the complexity of genuine experience. I realized I wasn't seeing my synesthetic visions made manifest. I was seeing what the house thought my visions should look like.
That must have been a profound moment of clarity.
It was the beginning of my awakening, but not yet my escape. Because even knowing the colors were artificial, they were still breathtakingly beautiful. Even understanding that the house was feeding me a kind of synthetic paradise, I didn't want to give it up. That's the real horror of the Bellwether House, Tony. It doesn't force you to stay. It just makes leaving feel like choosing misery over joy, limitation over infinite possibility.
How long did you continue living there after this realization?
Another 3 weeks. And during those weeks I began to understand what had really happened to the previous residents. They hadn't vanished. They'd made the same choice I was making every day. They'd chosen the beautiful dream over the complicated reality, and the house had obliged them by making that choice permanent.
Tomorrow, you're going to tell us about your escape from the house. But before we end today's conversation, I want to ask about something you mentioned earlier. Mrs. Patterson, the librarian who helped you during those first weeks. Did she play a role in your eventual awakening?
Voice softening. She saved my life, Tony, though I didn't understand it at the time. Even after I stopped visiting the library regularly, too absorbed in my house projects to need the outside world, Mrs. Patterson kept looking for me. She'd leave notes at places around town where she thought I might find them. Messages that reminded me there were people in the real world who cared about my well-being, not just my creativity.
We'll explore that connection tomorrow, along with your harrowing escape from what was becoming your beautiful prison. Thank you, Ezra.
Thank you, Tony. And to anyone listening, if you ever find a place that promises to fulfill your deepest dreams, make sure you can still hear the voices of people who love you for who you are, not just for what you can create.
Welcome back, everyone. This is Tony, and we're continuing our conversation with Ezra Blackwood about his extraordinary experience in the Bellwether House. Ezra, yesterday you ended with such a powerful statement about hearing the voices of people who love us for who we are. I've been thinking about Mrs. Patterson all night, this librarian who kept leaving you notes even when you'd stopped coming to the library.
Mrs. Patterson represents something I almost lost completely during those months in the house, Tony. She was my connection to unconditional human care, Someone who worried about me not because of what amazing things I could build, but simply because I was a 16-year-old boy who shouldn't be living alone.
Tell us about finding one of those notes. What was that experience like when you were so deep into the house's influence?
Pause. I remember the first note I found after weeks of isolation. I'd ventured into town for supplies, circuit boards and rare metals that even the house couldn't provide, and there was this small piece of yellow paper tucked under the windshield wiper of an abandoned car I always passed. It just said, "Ezra, I hope you're eating enough vegetables. The library has new books on applied physics that made me think of you. You're missed. Eleanor Patterson."
What was your emotional reaction to reading that?
I almost threw it away, Tony. That's how deep I was in the house's spell. The note felt like an intrusion, a reminder of a smaller, more limited world I'd outgrown. But something made me keep it, fold it up, and put it in my pocket. Later, when I was working on the reality engine, I'd sometimes touch that piece of paper and feel this strange sensation, like touching solid ground when you've been floating in deep water.
The house must have noticed your connection to these notes.
Oh, it absolutely did. After I found that first note, the house began offering me even more elaborate gifts. New rooms would appear overnight, a library that contained every book ever written about synesthesia, a music room where the walls themselves could play symphonies based on mathematical theorems. It was as if the house was competing with Mrs. Patterson's simple human kindness by offering me intellectual pleasures beyond imagination.
But the notes kept coming.
They did, and they became more pointed as time went on. Mrs. Patterson somehow knew I was in trouble, even though I thought I was hiding my situation perfectly. She left messages about missing person reports being filed, about social workers asking questions, about people in town who'd noticed the lights and strange sounds coming from the Bellwether house at all hours.
Did these warnings penetrate the sense of paradise you were experiencing?
They created cracks in it, Tony. Small fissures in the perfect reality the house had constructed around me. I'd be in the middle of some breakthrough with my inventions, surrounded by impossible colors and mathematical music, and I'd remember Mrs. Patterson's words about social workers. Suddenly the workshop would feel less like a sanctuary and more like a hiding place.
When did you realize you were in actual danger?
The moment of true terror came about 2.5 months after I'd first entered the house. I found a note from Mrs. Patterson that said, "Ezra, if you're reading this, please know that tomorrow is the deadline. Child Services will be conducting a full search starting Wednesday morning. If they can't locate you by Friday, you'll be declared a runaway, and the search will expand beyond Millbrook. Please come to the library. Before then, you have people who want to help you properly."
What made this note different from the others?
It included a date, Tony, and when I checked my own records, my project logs, my notebooks, I realized I had completely lost track of time. What I thought had been 2.5 months had actually been almost 5 months. The house had been gently distorting my perception of time's passage, keeping me in a bubble where days flowed together in an endless stream of creative fulfillment.
5 months instead of 2.5. That's a significant gap.
It was terrifying. But more than that, it was proof that the house wasn't just influencing my environment. It was influencing my mind directly. I started questioning everything. Had I really built those devices, or had the house created them and convinced me I was the inventor? Were my synesthetic visions actually guiding my work, or was I seeing what the house wanted me to see?
How did you test these suspicions?
I tried something the house couldn't have predicted because it was fundamentally opposed to everything it had been giving me. Instead of working on my inventions, I spent an entire day trying to leave. Not to abandon the house permanently, just to walk to the library and back. A simple test of whether I could still choose reality over paradise.
What happened when you tried to leave?
Long pause. The house fought me, Tony, but so subtly I almost didn't recognize it as resistance. Every time I approached the front door, I'd remember some crucial detail about a project that needed immediate attention. The reality engine would start humming more loudly, as if it required my presence to remain stable. Rooms I'd never seen before would reveal themselves, each one perfectly designed to capture my curiosity.
It sounds like the house was using your own mind against you.
Exactly. It had studied me for months, learned every trigger that could redirect my focus, every intellectual pleasure that could override my practical concerns. By the time I realized what was happening, I had spent the entire day moving deeper into the house instead of toward the exit, following a trail of fascinating discoveries that led me further and further from my goal of reaching the library.
That must have been when you truly understood the trap you were in.
It was the moment I realized that the previous residents hadn't vanished because they'd chosen to leave the outside world. They'd vanished because they'd lost the ability to choose anything else. The house had become their entire reality, not through force, but through the gradual erosion of their capacity to imagine existence beyond its walls.
Did you make another attempt to leave after that realization?
I tried, but each attempt became harder, not easier. The house seemed to learn from my resistance, adapting its methods to counter my strategies. When I tried leaving first thing in the morning, I'd wake up in the impossible workshop with no memory of going to sleep there. When I tried leaving through a window, I'd find myself somehow back in the main hallway, holding tools I didn't remember picking up.
Were you beginning to panic at this point?
I was beginning to understand that panic itself might be my salvation, Tony. The house thrived on my contentment, my sense of wonder and creative fulfillment, but panic was messy, uncontrollable, fundamentally opposed to the serene paradise it was trying to maintain. My fear was the one thing it couldn't transform into another gift, another reason to stay.
Tomorrow we're going to hear about your escape, how you finally broke free from the Bellwether house. But I'm curious, Ezra, during those final days when you were struggling to leave, did you encounter any direct evidence of the previous residents?
Voice dropping to almost a whisper, Tony, on my last night in the house, I found them. Not their bodies, not their belongings, but their consciousness, their awareness, still trapped in their perfect rooms, still creating their beautiful, impossible works of art. And they tried to warn me that I was about to join them permanently.
Ezra, when you say you found them, the previous residents, can you describe exactly what that encounter was like?
Long pause. I was in the impossible workshop, working late on what I thought would be improvements to the reality engine when I heard voices coming from deeper in the house. Not echoes or whispers, Tony, but actual conversations. People discussing their work, debating artistic techniques, sharing discoveries. It was the sound of a thriving creative community.
After months of isolation, that must have been both exciting and terrifying.
I followed the voices through corridors I'd never seen before, each one leading to studios and workshops that defied the house's original architecture. And there they were, Maria Vasquez at her easel, painting portraits that seemed to breathe on the canvas, Dr. Chen in her greenhouse, tending to flowers that bloomed in impossible colors, the Kowalski children playing with toys that moved and spoke like living creatures.
Could they see you? Did they acknowledge your presence?
At first, they seemed completely absorbed in their work, existing in their own perfect bubbles of creative fulfillment. But when I called out to Maria, I'd read so much about her in those notebooks, she turned and looked directly at me. Tony, her eyes held an awareness that was both brilliant and absolutely terrified.
What did she say to you?
She said, "You're the new one, aren't you? The boy with the colored mathematics." Her voice had this dreamy quality, like someone talking in their sleep, but underneath it was this desperate urgency. She told me I was beautiful here, that my work was magnificent, but that I needed to understand something crucial about the nature of our paradise.
What did she mean by that?
Maria explained that what I was seeing, her painting, Dr. Chen's garden, the children's magical playroom, these weren't real creative achievements. They were echoes, shadows of creativity that the house generated to keep our consciousness occupied, while it fed on our actual creative energy. We weren't creating anything real anymore, Tony. We were just going through the motions while the house consumed what made us truly human.
How did the other residents react when you spoke with them?
Dr. Chen was the most lucid. She told me she'd been trying to leave for what felt like decades, but every time she approached the boundaries of her greenhouse, paradise, she'd forget why leaving mattered. She said the house had learned to anticipate our escape attempts and redirect them into deeper exploration of our perfect prisons.
And the children? How were they coping with this realization?
Voice breaking slightly. The Kowalski children broke my heart, Tony. They'd been there the longest, and they'd almost completely forgotten the outside world existed. But in moments of clarity, they'd remember their parents, their real friends, and they'd cry for help while their magical toys tried to distract them with increasingly elaborate games.
This sounds like the moment when everything crystallized for you, the true horror of what the house was doing.
It was worse than I'd imagined, but also more seductive. Because even as these trapped souls were warning me, part of me was thinking how wonderful it would be to have their company, to be part of this eternal creative community. The house was using their presence to make permanent residence seem less like isolation and more like joining a family of brilliant artists.
Did they give you any advice about how to escape?
Maria grabbed my hands, and Tony, her touch felt real, solid, warm, and she said something that saved my life. She told me that the house could simulate everything except genuine human connection rooted in the messy, imperfect real world. She said to think about Mrs. Patterson's notes, about the people who cared about me not for my inventions but for my welfare.
How did this advice translate into action for you?
I realized I had been fighting the house with the same tools it had given me: intellectual analysis, creative problem-solving, systematic approaches. But Mrs. Patterson's care for me wasn't systematic or intellectual. It was purely emotional, purely human. I needed to stop trying to think my way out and start feeling my way out.
What was your emotional breakthrough?
I started crying, Tony. Right there in front of these trapped souls, I wept for the months I'd lost, for the real world I'd abandoned, for Mrs. Patterson, who was probably worried sick about me. And as I cried, something extraordinary happened. The perfect studios around me began to flicker and fade, like a television with poor reception.
The house couldn't maintain its illusions in the face of genuine grief?
That's exactly right. My tears weren't about creative frustration or intellectual puzzles. They were about loss, about human connection, about the fear that I might never see another real sunrise or have another conversation with someone who existed fully in the actual world. And the house had no response to that kind of raw, unproductive emotion.
Tomorrow we'll hear about your actual escape, how you finally broke free from the Bellwether house. But I have to ask, Ezra, did you see those residents again as you were leaving?
Whispers they were calling my name as I ran, Tony, begging me to remember them, to somehow find a way to help them escape too. That's a burden I carry to this day.
Ezra, I can hear in your voice how much weight you still carry from that moment. Hearing them call your name as you escaped, that's an incredible burden for anyone to bear, let alone someone who was still just 16 years old.
Pause it is, Tony. Even now, decades later, I sometimes wake up thinking I can hear Maria's voice asking if I've found a way back for them. The guilt of leaving them behind was almost enough to make me turn around and re-enter the house that night.
What stopped you from going back?
Mrs. Patterson, believe it or not. As I stumbled out of the Bellwether house, sobbing and disoriented, the first thing I saw was her yellow Volkswagen parked across the street. She'd been watching the house, Tony, waiting for me to emerge.
She was conducting her own kind of rescue mission.
She was. When she saw me come out, and I must have looked absolutely terrible, covered in months of grime, wearing clothes that barely fit anymore, she didn't ask questions or demand explanations. She just opened her car door and said, "Ezra, I've been worried sick about you. Let's get you somewhere warm and safe."
How did you respond to her kindness after months of isolation?
I almost couldn't handle it, Tony. Real human compassion felt so intense after the house's artificial paradise that I broke down completely. I cried harder in Mrs. Patterson's car than I had even inside the house. All those months of suppressed fear and loneliness came pouring out at once.
Did you tell her what had happened to you immediately?
I tried, but it sounded impossible even to me. How do you explain to a rational person that you've been living in a house that creates perfect rooms based on your desires, that feeds on creativity, that traps people in beautiful prisons? Mrs. Patterson listened without judgment, but I could see the concern in her eyes shifting from relief to worry about my mental state.
That must have been incredibly frustrating, to have lived through something so extraordinary and have it sound like a breakdown to the outside world.
It was terrifying, actually. For the first few days after my escape, I started wondering if I had experienced some kind of psychotic episode. Maybe I'd been living in a regular abandoned house, hallucinating all the impossible rooms and talking to imaginary people. The line between what was real and what wasn't had become completely blurred.
How did Mrs. Patterson help you navigate that uncertainty?
She did something brilliant, Tony. Instead of trying to convince me that what I'd experienced wasn't real, she focused on helping me reconnect with reality through small, concrete actions. She took me to get a proper meal, helped me find clean clothes that fit, made sure I had a safe place to sleep. She was rebuilding my relationship with the real world, one basic human need at a time.
Were there practical consequences you had to face? You mentioned child services was searching for you.
Size. That became its own crisis. I'd been missing for nearly 5 months and there were legal procedures that had been set in motion. Mrs. Patterson helped me navigate the interviews with social workers, the medical examinations, the psychological evaluations. Everyone was trying to understand what had happened to me and where I'd been living.
Did you stick to your story about the house?
At first I tried to tell the truth, but it was clear that wasn't going to help my case for independent living. So Mrs. Patterson and I worked out a version of events that was, let's say, simplified. I'd been squatting in the abandoned house, using my technical skills to make it livable, and I'd lost track of time while working on my inventions. Not the whole truth, but not entirely a lie either.
What about your living situation? You couldn't go back to your grandmother's house.
This is where Mrs. Patterson's kindness truly saved me, Tony. She had been researching options for months while I was missing, and she'd identified a foster family in Portland, the Hendersons, who specifically worked with gifted teenagers aging out of the system. She'd already spoken with them about me, shared my story, prepared them for a brilliant but traumatized young person who needed stability and understanding.
How did you feel about the prospect of living with strangers after your experience with the house?
Long pause. I was terrified of becoming dependent on another place, another situation that might not be what it seemed. The house had taught me that paradise could be a trap, but Mrs. Patterson helped me understand that real human relationships require trust despite risk. The Hendersons weren't offering me perfection. They were offering me genuine care with all its imperfections and uncertainties.
Did you maintain any connection to the Bellwether house after your escape?
I tried to stay away completely, but guilt about the trapped residents kept pulling me back. About a week after my escape, I convinced Mrs. Patterson to drive past the house with me. Tony, it looked completely different. Just a normal abandoned Victorian, with boarded windows and overgrown gardens, no lights, no humming energy, no sense of otherworldly presence.
The house had gone dormant without you?
Or maybe it was hiding, waiting for another vulnerable, creative person to need shelter. I realized then that my escape hadn't freed the others, it had just temporarily removed the house's current source of creative energy.
That realization must have been devastating, knowing that your escape didn't help the others who were still trapped inside.
It was crushing, Tony. I spent weeks researching everything I could about the house's history, trying to find some pattern or weakness that might help me free them. I contacted local historians, dug through property records, even tried reaching out to family members of the missing residents. But how do you explain to someone that their missing loved one is trapped in a supernatural house without sounding completely unhinged?
Did the Hendersons, your foster family, know about your obsession with the house?
Pause. They knew I was struggling with something, but I couldn't bring myself to tell them the whole truth initially. Here they were, offering me this genuine, imperfect home with real relationships and normal problems, and I was consumed by guilt over people they couldn't even verify existed. I was afraid they'd think I wasn't ready for their kind of stability.
How did that internal conflict affect your adjustment to living with them?
I was a mess, honestly. Sarah Henderson, she's a child psychologist. She could see I was carrying trauma that went deeper than just being homeless. And Mark, her husband, he's an engineer, so he was fascinated by my technical abilities but worried about how disconnected I seemed from normal teenage concerns. They were patient, but I could feel them walking on eggshells around me.
Were you still experiencing any effects from your time in the house?
Long pause. My synesthesia had changed, Tony. Before the house, mathematics appeared to me as beautiful flowing colors. But after my escape, numbers looked muted, almost gray. It was like the house had somehow enhanced my natural abilities, and returning to reality felt diminished. I worried constantly that I was losing the very gift that made me special.
That must have been terrifying for someone whose identity was so tied to their intellectual abilities.
It was existential crisis territory. I started questioning whether my synesthesia had ever been real, or if the house had been manufacturing enhanced perceptions to make me feel more creative and valuable. Was I actually a genius, or had I been living in an elaborate delusion? The uncertainty was eating me alive.
How did the Hendersons respond when they noticed your struggles?
Sarah finally confronted me about it directly. She sat me down one evening and said, "Ezra, you're mourning something, and until you can tell us what you've lost, we can't help you heal." Her directness was exactly what I needed. No manipulation, no perfect responses designed to make me comfortable, just honest human concern.
Did you tell them about the house then?
I told them everything, Tony. The whole impossible story. The reality engine, the trapped residents, my months of living in a technological paradise that fed on creativity. I was convinced they'd start making calls to psychiatric facilities, but instead Sarah asked me something that changed everything.
What did she ask?
She asked whether the experience felt more real or less real than sitting in their living room talking with them. And when I really examined that question, I realized that despite all its wonders, the house had always felt slightly artificial, like living inside a beautiful simulation. But the Hendersons' concern, their imperfect furniture, even their annoying cat, all of it felt solid and genuine in a way the house never had.
That sounds like an important breakthrough in your recovery.
It was the beginning of understanding that reality isn't diminished by being imperfect. It's defined by being imperfect. The house's paradise was hollow because it gave me everything I thought I wanted without any of the struggle or uncertainty that makes achievement meaningful. The Hendersons were offering me something much more valuable, authentic relationship with all its messiness and unpredictability.
Did your guilt about the trapped residents begin to resolve at this point?
Not resolve exactly, but transform. Mark, being an engineer, he helped me think about the problem differently. He pointed out that I couldn't save people by destroying myself with guilt, and that my unique experience might actually be valuable for helping others avoid the same trap. He suggested I consider whether sharing my story might be more helpful than trying to mount some impossible rescue mission.
Were you ready to start thinking about your experience as something that could help others?
Pause. It took time, Tony. Part of me still wanted to be the brilliant inventor who could devise some technical solution to free the trapped residents. But gradually I began to understand that the house's greatest weapon was isolation. It convinced each victim that they were alone with their perfect prison. Maybe the most subversive thing I could do was refuse to let the story remain secret.
Is that when you first considered that someday you might tell this story publicly?
The seed of that idea was definitely planted during my time with the Hendersons. They helped me see that survival isn't just about escaping a trap, it's about transforming your trauma into wisdom that might protect others. That became my new purpose, my way of honoring the people I couldn't save.
That transformation of purpose, from trying to rescue the trapped residents to honoring them by sharing your story, that's a profound shift for someone so young. How did that new sense of mission affect your daily life with the Hendersons?
It gave me something to work toward that felt meaningful without being impossible, Tony. Instead of obsessing over technical solutions I couldn't implement, I started focusing on documenting everything I could remember. Sarah suggested I keep a detailed journal, not just of the supernatural elements, but of the emotional journey, how the house made me feel what I was seeking when I first entered, how my needs and fears evolved during those months inside.
Did writing about the experience help clarify things that had been confusing while you lived through them?
Pause writing forced me to confront aspects of the experience I'd been avoiding, like how willing I'd been to abandon the outside world, how quickly I'd rationalized staying in the house even when I suspected something was wrong. I had to examine my own complicity in my captivity, and that was harder than blaming the house for everything that happened.
What did you discover about yourself through that process of honest reflection?
I discovered that I'd been running from more than just homelessness when I broke into the Bellwether house. I'd been running from grief about my grandmother's death, from fear about my future, from the overwhelming loneliness of being a brilliant teenager with no real peers or family support. The house didn't just trap me with paradise, it trapped me by offering solutions to problems I hadn't even admitted I was carrying.
How did the Hendersons respond as you shared these deeper insights with them?
They helped me understand that acknowledging those vulnerabilities didn't diminish my intelligence or make me weak. Mark told me something I'll never forget. He said that the smartest engineers he knew were the ones who could admit when they didn't understand something, because denial of complexity leads to catastrophic failures. My willingness to examine my own motivations honestly was actually a sign of intellectual maturity.
Were you able to reconnect with your synesthetic abilities during this period of self-reflection?
Gradually, yes, but they never returned exactly as they'd been before the house. The colors I see when working with mathematics are more subdued now, but they're also more nuanced. Sarah helped me realize that maybe the house had been amplifying my synesthesia artificially, and what I was experiencing now was my authentic baseline, less dramatic, but actually more trustworthy.
How did that change in your abilities affect your relationship with your own intelligence?
It forced me to develop a healthier relationship with being gifted, Tony. Inside the house, my intelligence felt like this overwhelming force that demanded constant expression and validation. But living with the Hendersons, I learned that intelligence is just one aspect of being human, valuable, but not the totality of my worth. They cared about whether I was kind, whether I was growing emotionally, whether I was building genuine connections with others.
Did you maintain any contact with Mrs. Patterson during this period?
Oh yes, she became like a beloved aunt to our little makeshift family. She'd visit regularly, and she was actually the one who helped me start thinking seriously about college applications. But more importantly, she helped me understand that my story might have academic value, that researchers studying anomalous phenomena might benefit from a detailed first-hand account, even if they couldn't verify the supernatural elements.
Were you ready to share your story beyond your immediate support network?
Not immediately. The idea was terrifying, actually. What if people dismissed me as delusional? What if my account somehow led other vulnerable people to seek out the house? I felt an enormous responsibility to tell the story in a way that would warn people without making the house sound appealing to those who might be desperate enough to take the risk.
How did you work through those concerns about the potential consequences of going public?
Sarah suggested I start small, maybe writing an anonymous account for an online forum dedicated to unexplained phenomena, just to test how people might react to the story and see if anyone else had similar experiences. That seemed manageable, like I could share the warning without fully exposing myself if people responded with ridicule or disbelief.
Did you find others who had encountered similar supernatural traps?
Voice becoming more intense. Tony, that's when I realized the Bellwether House might not be unique. I received dozens of messages from people describing places that offered them exactly what they needed most. A library that contained every book ever written, an art studio where paintings came to life, a workshop where every invention actually worked perfectly. The details were different, but the pattern was identical: desperate creative people finding supernatural sanctuaries that gradually became beautiful prisons.
How did that revelation change your understanding of your own experience?
It shifted my perspective completely. I'd been thinking of myself as a victim of one anomalous house, but I started to see that I might be part of a much larger phenomenon. Maybe there were entities or forces that specifically targeted creative people during vulnerable moments, offering supernatural solutions to very human problems. The scope of potential victims suddenly felt overwhelming.
Did connecting with other survivors help ease your guilt about the people you couldn't save?
Long pause. It complicated my guilt, actually. On one hand, knowing I wasn't alone in this experience was deeply validating. I wasn't crazy, and I wasn't uniquely weak for falling into the trap. But on the other hand, realizing how many creative people might be trapped in similar situations around the world made my failure to save the Bellwether House residents feel even more significant. If I couldn't help people I'd actually met and spoken with, how could I hope to address a problem of this magnitude?
How did your foster family help you cope with that expanded sense of responsibility?
Mark gave me some advice that probably saved my sanity. He reminded me that in engineering, you can't fix a complex system until you fully understand how it works, and rushing to implement solutions without proper analysis usually makes things worse. He suggested my job right now wasn't to save everyone. It was to become the world's foremost expert on my own experience, so that someday I might contribute to larger solutions developed by teams of people working together.
That's when you decided to pursue formal education, rather than trying to solve everything independently.
Exactly. The house had taught me to value isolation and self-reliance, but the Hendersons showed me that the most important human achievements come from collaboration and community. I started seeing college not as a distraction from my mission, but as preparation for it. I needed to understand psychology, sociology, maybe even physics at a much deeper level before I could hope to make meaningful contributions to understanding these phenomena.
As we near the end of our conversation, Ezra, I'm curious about how your memory of the trapped residents evolved during this period of growth and healing.
Softly, they stopped feeling like my personal failure and started feeling like my teachers. Tony Maria's warning about authentic human connection, Dr. Chen's insights about the house's feeding mechanisms, even the Kowalski children's innocent trust. They'd all given me pieces of understanding that helped me escape. My memory of them shifted from being a source of pure guilt to being a source of wisdom I was responsible for preserving and sharing. They deserve to be remembered not just as victims, but as people who use their final moments of clarity to help someone else find freedom.
That shift in how you remembered them, from victims to teachers, that must have been profound for your healing process. But I imagine it also brought new kinds of responsibility.
Pause, it did, Tony. Once I started honoring their wisdom instead of just mourning their fate, I felt obligated to live up to what they'd taught me. Maria had warned me about choosing authentic connection over perfect isolation. Dr. Chen had helped me understand how the house fed on creative energy. I couldn't just carry that knowledge. I had to embody it in how I lived my life.
How did that sense of obligation manifest in your daily choices during those months with the Hendersons?
It meant forcing myself to be vulnerable in ways that terrified me. When Mark would invite me to help with household repairs instead of retreating to my room to work on solitary projects, I'd say yes, even though collaboration felt risky. When Sarah suggested family game nights, I'd participate even though the casual intimacy felt foreign after months of supernatural isolation. Every choice to engage authentically felt like honoring their sacrifice.
Were there moments when you felt like you were betraying their memory by moving forward with your own life?
Voice becoming quieter constantly, especially when I'd catch myself laughing at something Mark said, or feeling genuinely excited about a college brochure Sarah showed me. Part of me felt like happiness was a betrayal of people who would never experience joy again. But Mrs. Patterson helped me see that wasting my freedom would dishonor their sacrifice more than embracing it ever could.
How did Mrs. Patterson help you work through that survivor's guilt?
She told me about her own experience losing colleagues in industrial accidents, how she initially felt guilty for continuing her engineering career while they couldn't, but she realized that abandoning the work they'd all cared about would make their deaths meaningless. She said the trapped residents had used their final moments of clarity to give me tools for freedom, and refusing to use those tools was like throwing their gift away.
During this period of processing and growth, did your understanding of what the house actually was continue to evolve?
Pause. Living with the Hendersons taught me something crucial about the house's true nature. I'd initially thought of it as evil, but that wasn't quite right. The house was more like a perfect predator. It gave people exactly what they thought they needed, which made it almost impossible to recognize the trap. It wasn't malicious so much as efficient at exploiting human vulnerability.
That's a more nuanced understanding than simply calling it evil. How did that shift in perspective change your feelings about your own experience there?
It helped me stop feeling ashamed for being deceived, Tony. The house hadn't targeted me because I was weak or stupid. It had targeted me because I was creative and desperate, which made me an ideal source of the energy it needed. Understanding that I'd been chosen for my strengths, rather than my weaknesses, helped me reclaim some sense of personal worth.
Were you able to share these insights with the other survivors you'd connected with online?
I tried, but many of them were still in earlier stages of processing their experiences. Some were angry. They wanted to think of their captors as purely evil because that felt simpler than acknowledging how perfectly the traps had been designed for their specific needs. Others were still grieving the loss of their supernatural paradises, which made it hard for them to analyze the experiences objectively.
How did witnessing their different stages of recovery affect your own healing process?
It made me incredibly grateful for the support system I'd found with the Hendersons and Mrs. Patterson. Many of the other survivors were trying to process their experiences alone, just as I'd initially tried to do. Seeing their struggles reinforced how essential authentic human connection was for healing from supernatural trauma. The house had taught us all to value isolation, so we had to consciously practice trust and vulnerability.
Looking back now, do you think your synesthetic abilities helped or hindered your recovery during this period?
Thoughtful pause, both, actually. My synesthesia made it easier to detect when emotions or memories were becoming overwhelming. They'd appear as discordant colors that warned me to seek support before I spiraled. But it also meant I sometimes experienced flashbacks to the house with vivid visual intensity that made them feel more real than my present circumstances. Sarah helped me develop techniques for grounding myself when the past became more colorful than the present.
As you prepared for college applications, How did you grapple with the question of whether to include your experiences with the house in your personal essays?
That was agonizing, Tony. How do you explain a gap in your education without sounding delusional? How do you describe personal growth that resulted from supernatural trauma? I ended up writing about homelessness and finding stability with foster family, which was true as far as it went. But leaving out the most transformative aspects of my experience felt like living a partial truth.
Did that decision to present a sanitized version of your story feel like another form of isolation?
Long pause. Yes, and it taught me something important about the long-term effects of supernatural trauma. Even after escaping the house, even after finding genuine community with the Hendersons, I was still keeping crucial parts of myself hidden. The house's lesson about the danger of being truly known was still controlling my choices. That's when I realized healing wasn't just about escaping, it was about gradually learning to trust reality enough to be completely authentic within it.
That realization about still hiding parts of yourself, how did that awareness change your approach to the college application process and your relationships with the Hendersons?
It forced me to make a conscious choice about authenticity, Tony. I remember sitting at the kitchen table one evening, staring at my half-finished essay about overcoming homelessness, and suddenly understanding that I was recreating the house's pattern of showing people only what they wanted to see. I was crafting a version of myself that would be acceptable to admissions committees, just like the house had crafted perfect solutions for each of its victims.
Did you end up rewriting the essay to include more of your actual experience?
Pause. I wrote two versions. One was the safe version about homelessness and foster care. The other was completely honest about finding an abandoned house that seemed to offer impossible solutions, about becoming psychologically dependent on a place that felt more real than reality, about learning to distinguish between authentic growth and beautiful captivity. I never submitted the honest version, but writing it helped me understand how deeply the house's lessons about concealment had affected me.
How did the Hendersons respond when you shared this internal conflict with them?
Sarah said something that changed everything for me. She told me that the college essay wasn't really the issue. It was just a symptom of a larger question about whether I trusted the world enough to be genuinely known by it. She pointed out that I'd been living with them for months while maintaining this enormous secret about the most formative experience of my life. She wasn't hurt, but she helped me see that complete intimacy requires complete honesty.
Were you ready to tell them the full truth about the Bellwether house?
Long pause. It took weeks to work up the courage, but yes. One night after dinner, I asked them to sit with me in the living room because I had something important to share. I told them everything, the impossible rooms, the trapped residents, the way the house fed on creativity and ambition, the months I spent believing I was living in paradise while slowly being consumed.
How did they react to learning that their foster son had survived something so far outside normal human experience?
Tony, their response taught me what unconditional acceptance actually looks like. Mark's engineering mind immediately started asking technical questions about the house's anomalies, but not in a way that felt like he was testing my sanity. Sarah focused on the emotional journey, how isolated I must have felt, how terrifying the escape must have been. Neither of them dismissed what I was telling them, or suggested I might have imagined it.
Did sharing the complete truth change the dynamic of your relationship with them?
It deepened it in ways I hadn't expected. Suddenly, all my quirks made sense to them, why I sometimes seemed afraid of getting too comfortable, why I was so vigilant about distinguishing between wants and needs, why I occasionally became agitated when things felt too perfect. They started understanding my behavior as intelligent adaptations to supernatural trauma rather than random teenage moodiness.
And how did it feel for you to finally be completely known by people who cared about you?
Voice becoming emotional, liberating, and terrifying at the same time. The house had taught me that being fully known was dangerous, that people would reject you if they saw who you really were. But the Hendersons proved that authentic intimacy was possible, that you could be completely transparent about your experiences and still be loved. It was like discovering I'd been holding my breath for months and could finally exhale.
Did this experience of complete honesty influence how you connected with the other survivors you'd been corresponding with online?
Absolutely. I started sharing more openly in those forums about the emotional aspects of recovery, not just the supernatural details of the experiences. I talked about the ongoing challenge of trusting reality, about the way beautiful captivity could feel preferable to difficult freedom, about the importance of finding people who could accept the full truth of what had happened to us.
How did the other survivors respond to that level of vulnerability?
Pause. It was mixed, Tony. Some people weren't ready for that kind of honesty. They were still protecting themselves by keeping their experiences compartmentalized. But others began opening up about their own struggles with authenticity and trust. We started developing a genuine support network instead of just sharing supernatural war stories.
Looking back, do you see that moment of complete honesty with the Hendersons as a turning point in your recovery?
It was the moment I truly escaped the house's influence. Not physically, I'd done that months earlier, but psychologically and emotionally I was still carrying its lesson that authentic connection was impossible. When Mark and Sarah accepted the full truth about my experience and continued treating me as family, I finally understood that the house's most fundamental premise about human nature was wrong. Real intimacy was not only possible, it was the actual antidote to the kind of isolation the house represented.
Ezra, as we've talked about your recovery and growth with the Hendersons, I've been struck by something. You've described the house as targeting creative, desperate people, but you were 16 when this happened. That seems quite young for the pattern you've described among other survivors.
Long pause. You're right to notice that, Tony. The other survivors I connected with were all adults when they found their supernatural sanctuaries. Most were in their 20s or 30s, established in their creative fields but hitting major life crises. I was the youngest person in those online forums by at least 5 years.
Did that age difference affect how you understood your own experience?
For months, I thought it meant I was somehow more vulnerable than the others, that maybe I'd been an easier target because I was just a desperate kid. But then Mrs. Patterson helped me see something I'd been missing. She asked me to describe my inventions from before the house, and as I talked about the electronic systems I'd built, the mathematical principles I'd intuited, she made an observation that changed everything.
What did she realize?
Voice becoming quieter that I wasn't actually 16 in terms of creative development, Tony. She said that based on what I was describing, I had the technical abilities and innovative thinking of someone in their mid-20s, someone who should have been finishing graduate school in engineering or physics. My chronological age was 16, but my creative capacity was much more advanced.
So the house wasn't targeting a child. It was targeting a prodigy whose abilities were trapped in a teenager's circumstances.
Exactly. Mrs. Patterson helped me understand that my homelessness wasn't just about losing my grandmother. It was about being an adult-level creative mind stuck in a minor's body, with no legal autonomy to pursue the work I was capable of doing. Most gifted teenagers have families who can support their development, but I was completely alone with abilities I had no framework for using.
That realization must have shifted how you thought about the house's interest in you.
It explained everything, Tony. The house hadn't randomly chosen a homeless teenager. It had specifically targeted someone whose creative potential was being wasted by circumstance. I was probably generating the kind of frustrated creative energy that these entities find most appealing. A brilliant mind with nowhere to grow is like a perfect storm for supernatural predation.
How did understanding this change your relationship to your own abilities?
It helped me stop seeing my intelligence as the thing that had made me vulnerable, and start seeing it as something that deserved proper cultivation.
That shift from seeing your intelligence as a vulnerability to seeing it as something worth cultivating. That sounds like it required serious mental preparation for what came next.
Pause, it did, Tony. Because once I understood that my abilities deserved proper development, I had to face the reality that the house was still out there, still feeding on other brilliant minds who found themselves trapped by circumstances. I couldn't just focus on my own recovery anymore.
When did you first realize you might need to take action beyond your personal healing?
It was during one of those online forum discussions. A new survivor had joined, a young architect named David who'd escaped something similar to the Bellwether House just weeks earlier. As he described his experience, I recognized patterns that the other survivors had missed. The way he talked about impossible geometries, about rooms that rebuilt themselves around his deepest architectural fantasies. I knew his entity was still active.
How did that recognition change your perspective on your own survival?
Voice becoming more urgent, I realized I hadn't just escaped for my own sake, Tony. Dr. Chen, Maria, the Kowalski children, They'd all sacrificed their final moments of clarity to give me knowledge, not just so I could be free, but so I could help others recognize these traps before it was too late. Their gift came with responsibility.
Did you discuss this realization with the Hendersons?
Sarah was the one who helped me understand what I was really grappling with. She said I was experiencing survivor's purpose, the need to transform trauma into meaningful action. But she also warned me that trying to save everyone could become another form of beautiful captivity if I wasn't careful. The urge to be a hero can be just as dangerous as the urge to be safe.
How did you prepare yourself mentally for the possibility of confronting these entities again?
Long pause. I had to accept that my synesthesia, my technical abilities, everything that had made me a target, those same traits could make me uniquely qualified to help others escape, but I also had to stay grounded in authentic human connection. Mrs. Patterson helped me develop protocols for staying anchored to reality while investigating supernatural phenomena.
What kind of protocols?
Daily check-ins with the Hendersons about my emotional state. Clear boundaries about when to retreat if an investigation felt too seductive. Most importantly, never working alone. Always having someone who could pull me back if I started losing myself in the beauty of impossible solutions again.
Were you afraid of being drawn back in?
Terrified. But I was more afraid of other people experiencing what I had experienced without anyone to help them find their way out.
That fear of others experiencing what you went through, how did it manifest as you started planning to actually help people like David?
It became an urgency I'd never felt before, Tony. I started having dreams about Dr. Chen and Maria, but instead of nightmares, they were conversations. They'd ask me what I was doing with the knowledge they'd died to give me. I'd wake up with this crushing sense that every day I delayed action, someone else was being drawn into a beautiful trap.
How did the Hendersons react when you told them you wanted to actively investigate these supernatural entities?
Pause. Mark's engineering background made him surprisingly practical about it. He said if these things operated according to consistent principles, they could be studied and countered. Sarah was more concerned about the psychological risks, but she also understood that I needed to transform my trauma into purpose, or it would consume me anyway.
Did you develop a specific plan for how to approach David's situation?
Mrs. Patterson helped me create what we called a reality anchor protocol. The idea was to establish contact with David while he was still lucid, help him document his experiences in real time, and most importantly, give him external verification that his escape was possible. The entities rely on their victims feeling completely isolated.
How did you prepare emotionally for the possibility that you might not be able to save everyone?
Voice becoming steadier. That was the hardest part, Tony. I had to accept that some people might choose the beautiful captivity even after understanding what it was. Mrs. Patterson taught me that rescue only works when someone wants to be rescued. My job wasn't to save everyone. It was to make sure people could make informed choices about their situations.
Were you concerned about your own safety while planning these interventions?
Constantly. But I realized that my terror was actually protective. It meant I was staying grounded in reality instead of romanticizing the danger. Sarah made me promise that if I ever started feeling excited about confronting these entities, I'd step back immediately. Excitement meant I was being seduced again.
As you prepared for what might be your final confrontation with forces like the Bellwether House, what gave you the courage to move forward?
Long pause, the knowledge that Dr. Chen had faced this same choice and chosen to act, even knowing it would cost her everything. She'd shown me that sometimes the most important thing you can do is help one person see clearly, even if it's the last thing you ever do. I couldn't honor her sacrifice by staying safe while others suffered alone.
When the moment came to actually contact David, to reach out to someone still trapped in that seductive state, how did you find the right words?
Long pause. I almost didn't, Tony. I stared at my computer for hours, typing and deleting messages. How do you tell someone their paradise is a prison without sounding like you're trying to destroy something beautiful? Finally, I remembered what Dr. Chen had done for me. She didn't attack the house directly. She asked me questions that helped me see the contradictions myself.
What was David's initial response when you reached out?
He was defensive, exactly like I would have been. He told me his architectural sanctuary was different, that his entity genuinely cared about his creative vision. But then I asked him the question that Mrs. Patterson had taught me. When was the last time you felt genuinely disappointed by something your sanctuary created? The silence after that question lasted almost 10 minutes.
What happened in those 10 minutes?
Voice becoming emotional. I could feel him thinking, Tony. Really thinking for the first time in weeks, because disappointment is how we know we're dealing with reality, when things don't always align with our desires. His sanctuary had never disappointed him, never challenged him, never asked him to grow beyond his current understanding. It only reflected back exactly what he already wanted to see.
Was that the breakthrough moment?
It was the beginning. David started asking questions. Why did his architectural innovations feel hollow despite being technically perfect? Why did he feel increasingly disconnected from his own creativity? I helped him recognize that true creative growth requires resistance, failure, genuine surprise. His entity was giving him the aesthetic of innovation without any actual development.
How did you guide him through the escape process?
Pause. I told him about Dr. Chen's sacrifice, about Maria's final words, about the choice between beautiful captivity and difficult authenticity. But most importantly, I promised him he wouldn't be alone on the outside. That was what none of us had been told, that reality includes genuine connection with people who accept your complete truth.
Did David choose to leave?
Voice breaking slightly. He did, Tony. And when he emerged from that architectural paradise, confused and disoriented but free, I understood why Dr. Chen had given everything to save me. The moment David sent me his first message from outside, "The buildings here are imperfect and they're beautiful," I knew that some gifts can only be honored by passing them forward.
How did that success change your understanding of your own purpose?
It taught me that surviving wasn't enough. Healing meant using my experience to help others distinguish between salvation and the most beautiful prison ever conceived.
Ezra, helping David escape must have been incredibly validating, but I imagine it also raised difficult questions about the others you might not be able to reach.
Pause. That's exactly what kept me awake for weeks afterward, Tony. David's success proved these rescues were possible, but it also meant I had to face the reality that Dr. Chen, Maria, the Kowalski children, they could have been saved if someone had reached them in time. The weight of that knowledge was almost unbearable.
How did you process that guilt without letting it consume you?
Sarah helped me understand something crucial, that survivor's guilt transforms into survivor's purpose, not through saving everyone, but through accepting that each person you help represents all the ones you couldn't. David's freedom honored every person who died in those sanctuaries, including the ones who helped me escape.
Did this perspective change how you approached other potential interventions?
It taught me to focus on sustainable impact rather than heroic gestures. I started developing resources, warning signs, reality anchor techniques, support networks for people questioning their seemingly perfect situations. The goal became prevention and education rather than dramatic last-minute rescues.
As we reach the end of our conversation, Ezra, I'm struck by how your story began with a brilliant homeless teenager seeking shelter and evolved into something much larger. What do you see when you look back at that 16-year-old breaking into the Bellwether house?
Long pause. I see someone who was already asking the right questions, Tony, even if he didn't know it yet. That boy was desperate for a place where his mind could flourish, but he was also suspicious enough to notice when perfection felt wrong. The synesthesia that made mathematics beautiful to him also made him sensitive to when that beauty became too seductive.
And now, years later, how has that sensitivity shaped your ongoing work?
It's become my compass. I can still see the appeal of supernatural sanctuaries. That desire for a place where creativity flows without resistance never fully disappears. But I've learned to recognize the difference between inspiration and seduction, between growth and stagnation disguised as paradise.
What would you want people to remember from your experience?
That the most dangerous prisons are the ones we never want to leave, and that authentic connection, messy, difficult, real human intimacy, is always worth more than perfect solitude.
Those seem like hard-won insights, Ezra. As we close, I'm curious, do you still see mathematics in colors the way you did as that 16-year-old?
Soft laugh, yes, but they're different colors now, Tony. Before the house, mathematical equations appeared as these pristine, almost crystalline patterns. Inside the Bellwether house, they became impossibly vivid, like stained glass windows made of pure logic. Now they're warmer, more organic, They have the irregularities that come from being part of a real world with real relationships.
That sounds like a metaphor for your entire journey.
In many ways, it is. The house promised perfection, but perfection is static. Real beauty comes from imperfection, from the unpredictable interactions between minds that genuinely challenge each other. My synesthesia still makes mathematics gorgeous, but now that beauty includes the messy, difficult work of authentic connection.
Any final thoughts for our listeners?
Trust your discomfort with paradise, especially when it's offered during your darkest moments. And remember that the most profound sanctuaries aren't places that protect you from difficulty, they're relationships that help you grow through it.
Thank you, Ezra, for sharing your extraordinary story with us.